Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Today's lecture is on kinds of research. During our brief description of this topic, my focus shall be on, of course, the examples from translation studies, as the course belongs to the area of translation studies or research in the area of translation studies. This topic has been divided into 6 points: conceptual and empirical research, the differences. Number 2, characteristics of empirical research. Number 3, subtypes of empirical research. Number 4, qualitative versus quantitative research. Number 5, examples of empirical research methods. And at the end, which is number 6, applied research. Before I proceed, one point should be kept in our mind, that in this topic, not all the research kinds have been discussed, because the research can be divided into many kinds and categories, keeping in view different aspects and different nature of the direction of research and so on. Nevertheless, the main kinds have been covered in this lecture that are most relevant to the research in the area of translation studies. Point number 1 is conceptual and empirical research, and the focus is on the differences. And for that purpose, you can see a table in front of you. On one side, on one column, we have conceptual research and or features of conceptual research, and on the other column, we have the features of empirical research. So the conceptual research is basically a theoretical in its nature, whereas the empirical, as the name suggests itself, is in its nature is a practical, or it has a practical aspects. Conceptual research belongs to the hermeneutics, that is the explanation or interpretation of a phenomenon, whereas the empirical research focuses on the positivism, which is again the focus on the doing side and not the thinking side. Conceptual research is mostly done in the area of humanistic disciplines like philosophy, literature, aesthetic, translation studies, history, and so on. But that is mostly, whereas the empirical research is mostly applied in the area of pure sciences. In the conceptual research, the focus remains on ideas or interpretation of ideas or reinterpretation of ideas or search for new ideas. Whereas in the area of empirical research, the focus remains on the data, which is the observation of data, or seeks new data, or seeking evidence or new evidence that supports or disconfirms some hypothesis, and so on, so forth. With all these differences between conceptual and empirical research, one point should also be kept in our mind as students of research in the area of translation studies, that both approaches are necessary in translation studies. This is very, very important. And the difference between these two actually has been exaggerated, and we shall try to understand this exaggerated differences between these two types of research with these examples. You cannot observe anything, that is the of course part of empirical research, without some kind of preliminary theory, that is the concept. If you don't have a concept in your mind as a researcher, you cannot conduct some kind of empirical observation on some translational phenomenon. What you take to be a fact depends on your initial theoretical assumptions. Again, when you take something as a fact, that this is a fact, some phenomenon is a fact in the area of translation studies, basically it depends on the initial theoretical assumption about that phenomenon being a fact or taken as a fact. Any hypothesis must be formulated in terms of concepts of some kind. Hypothesis as essential characteristics of empirical research must be formulated in terms of a concept of some mind. So ideas and data, they actually work hand in hand in the area of research in general, although the distinction between conceptual and empirical research can be made as we have done in the previous slide. Now we discuss the characteristics of empirical research, and we have four characteristics. Number one, particular and general, describing and explaining and predicting, and a hypothesis. Mind you, we are talking about the empirical research. As for the characteristic number one, which is particular and general, actually the tendency of a research is to find the some particular phenomenon or something which is very much particular and unique in some research question, and that is prevalent in all branches of social and pure sciences. So we see in translation studies, for example, what makes particular translation unique, and we can imagine here a lot of examples: translated text, books, translated the religious texts that have been translated in different ways. So what made this particular translation a unique translation is actually is an attempt to answer a particular question. And again, general patterns, the same is true about searching for the general patterns, regularities, or universal in the area of translation studies. So being basic characteristics of empirical research, both are essential here. Looking for the particular phenomenon, particular reasons for something, and then generalizing them on others. The second characteristic is describing and explaining. Describing is to answer what is or what it is that we see and observe, is description. But explaining is a little complex activity where the researcher deals with the bigger questions like why it is so, how it can be so and so, and how it became in this form, and what for. So both these characteristics are essential part of empirical research, where describing is the first step, and then the explaining, we can call this analysis as well, is the further step. The third characteristics of empirical research is predicting, and prediction, of course, on the basis of known causes of something. Predictions are two types: deterministic, which are 100% true predictions based on the real causes, and probabilistic, that is less than 100%. In the area of translation studies, the predictions are all the predictions are probabilistic, because not only in translation studies, in humanities and social sciences, this is the basic nature of these areas. The characteristic number 4 of the empirical research is existence of a hypothesis. What is an hypothesis? Is actually a tentative claim to talk about some phenomenon, or some reality, and then of course do the research based on that hypothesis, or it is an attempt at generalization. Uh, for example, we can take a quick example, which is not, of course, a very technical hypothesis, but this and a tentative claim about that with the knowledge, with the good knowledge of Quranic sciences, a, a translator can translate the text of the Holy Quran into Urdu successfully. With now, this tentative claim says that the uh, good knowledge in the Quranic sciences, Ulumul Quran, a translator can really justify his or her translation into Urdu language, but we need to, of course, test this hypothesis by conducting research. Next point is subtypes of empirical research, and we have two here: naturalistic versus experimental. And the purpose here is to know the differences between naturalistic and the experimental research of these two kinds that belongs to empirical research. So what is a naturalistic research? Is observing a phenomenon or a process as it takes place in a natural setting and without interference, without least interference. That is the key difference here, key element here in naturalistic, where observation, of course, is everywhere. Observation in experimental research is also based on observation, but here the observation is free of any control or free of any interference. The examples are here: working procedures of translators or working procedures of interpreters, without putting any conditions, without bringing some controlling factors, or something like that. Or computer record of the keyboard used by a translator. Of course, here we have software that helps the researcher to track the uh, keyboard usage by a translator, if we are, of course, doing this naturalistic research on a translator, on a process of translation, and so on. On the other hand is experimental. Experimental, the key element here is the control, and this controlling is done by interfering to isolate features of study. The example here: how trainee translators revise their work. This can be one example of doing experimental empirical research. And another example also is possible to compare between how the trainee translators on one side and how the professional translators on other side revise their work, and then a comparison can be conducted. So we have put here a control which is called trainee translators, and on the other side is the professional translators, and we try to compare their revision techniques, or compare between their revision techniques. Qualitative versus quantitative research. Again, the main purpose here to understand the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative researches. A qualitative research is to describe the quality of something, of course, derived from the name quality, and qualitative is the quality of something. It is more subjective, and we have here very good elaborative example of a research done by Douglas Hofstadter, who studied a single translation of a single poem into with 70 translations, English translations, and his focus was on that these single poem can be translated in so many ways, 70 ways. So here the focus is on to describe, to explain, and to elaborate the quality of the translations in these 70 different translations into English language. The quantitative, of course, here the focus is very much different. It seeks to measure, count, compare statistically. It also seeks to describe generality, coverage, regularities, tendencies, frequencies, distribution. So here the statistic is more used. It is actually is dealing with the counting, the numbers and divisions, and the average and so on. Quantitative research has tendency towards the more objective type of research. The this also very important, as we discussed in the conceptual and empirical research. Here also, the research projects may have the elements of both. That doesn't mean a qualitative research should be independent of any quantitative, and vice versa. Rather, the combination is in something which is considered ideal, but both can be carried out independently. Examples of empirical research methods. So we have here the four examples, case studies. What is a case studies? The focus in the area of case studies is on limited situation in a natural context. Example: single translator is a case study. Single translation company is a case study. Single translation work is a an example of case study. So there are three kinds or three purposes of these case studies. In other words, we can call them purposes. The exploratory, where the purpose is what can we find out about X, that is the case in consideration or case under research. And the second is descriptive, and that is what is the nature of X. And the third is explanatory, why X and how X, the more complex answer to the more complex questions. The second example of empirical research method is the corpus-based studies. We all know what are the corpus-based studies, because they are based on a wide range of textual data and using the concordance software for the purpose of classifications or making lists, and of course the indexes. Corpus have two types: is parallel, which is the translated, the original along with the translated, and comparable, original with the originally written text in the target language with the same purpose or in the same area. Uh, when we talk about the corpus-based study, we usually try to distinguish between these two, parallel and comparable. But in other contexts, the parallel, the term parallel actually sometime is used to cover both types of the research, and even comparable is also used interchangeably. The third example of empirical research method is conducting survey or survey studies, where of course the survey is conducted through questionnaire or interviews and so on, and also historical and archival research methods. At the end, the applied research is what is applied research? Applied research is an application of previously done research, theories and concept. The main focus in the area of applied research is on the application, or the possibility of application of something which is previously done. And what is that previously done something? Is either research or a theory or a strategy or a concept, to the second main element of applied research, to a hypothesis, applicability again for solving some issue, which is of course a practical problem, or fulfilling a need, or finding a solution for a problem. So this is the concept of the applied research, or purpose of the applied research. Example: this can be the hypothesis A, for example, which is based on B, whose claim is based on C, to find out solution for D. So A is done, B is done, and C is also already done. But the purpose of this applied research, this example in the area of applied research, is to find out a solution for a situation D, or for a problem D. So I think with this we end this brief lecture or description of the points. Take very good care of yourself, my dear students. Assalamu alaikum.